Morning, Liam. Let's talk about the state of the economy and GDP. First and foremost, should we? What do you make of it?
OK, this is actually a mixed picture. On the one hand, our own Office for National Statistics has brought out a number this morning that shows GDP in the last month fell. But these monthly numbers, they get revised and revised and revised. And I think that's because of the various bank holidays linked to the funeral of Her Majesty the Queen. So I don't think that's anything in particular to worry about. And on the other side of the equation, you mentioned there that the International Monetary Fund, the Washington-based sort of global economic watchdog, self-appointed, they say that inflation in the UK will remain quite high. That's true because we import a lot of stuff, and when your currency goes down, imports become more expensive. But I don't think the media is focused enough on the fact that the International Monetary Fund is saying that we are going to be the fastest growing economy in the G7 this year. We're going to grow by 3.6% this year. The economy is going to expand compared to 1.5% in Germany and around 2% in the US. So on the growth front, Stephen, it's a bit of a mixed picture.
But isn't that growth forecast based on where we were before the mini-budget?
Yeah. And a lot of people think, including the International Monetary Fund, that the mini-budget will actually increase growth.
Do they?
To a degree, though, of course, it's rocky, as we're seeing today in the financial markets.
Yeah.
OK, so give us a little bit of context then about what we saw in the markets as a result of the Bank of England and this announcement on gilts and pension funds and this Friday deadline.
Yeah, who would have thought that they'd have to get interested in gilts and 10-year bonds and all the kind of mad stuff that people like me talk about on television from time to time? You do need to worry about this if you've got debt, if you have a mortgage and you need to remortgage, because these borrowing costs for the government in the market, when the government borrows money off pension funds, insurance companies, other investors, they really set the benchmark above the Bank of England's base rate for where mortgage lending costs are, where personal loan lending costs are. And those borrowing costs have gone up a little bit this morning. They're actually quite steady, around 4.5%. And actually, the pound has recovered. I know we were just reading a headline there. The pound is sort of back above where it was this time yesterday. So for now, at least, the market seems to be absorbing what the Bank of England is saying. But I wanted to just show you a couple of graphics, which I think, aren't stressed enough on television. This is the first one, and GBNews audience on the radio, I'll just talk you through it as well. What this graph shows, Stephen and Isabel, is that in January this year, the average mortgage rate, this is 2-year, 5-year, it's like I've done a sort of composite rate, was about 3.5%. And you'll see that walks up steadily until September, way before the mini-budget, to 4.5%. So the point I'm trying to make there is that this isn't a kind of sudden increase in mortgage costs because of the mini-budget. This has been going for a long, long time. Now, I've put there in a box, now approximately 6%, because they are. But we've seen this sort of uptick in mortgage costs across the world in October. Why? Because central banks are now finally starting to retreat from that massive monetary money printing, those ultra-low interest rates that we had for about 10 years after the global financial crisis. So the mini-budget, it was politically tin-eared, in my view, lowering the top rate of tax for 2% of earners in the middle of a cost of living crisis. But it by no means is the whole story about what's happening here.
Which is why I've been trying to get from economic experts over the last few days a clear answer as to why a lot of people, look at the polls, a lot of our viewers and listeners, as well as politicians on the Labour benches and indeed some of the Tory backbenches, are saying that these problems that we're having with increased, particularly when you talk about housing, is down to government. It's down to government policy. It's down to the mini-budget. It's down to Trussonomics. Well, that doesn't actually appear to be true.
Well, as Mandy Rice-Davis once said, they would say that, wouldn't they? In the Profumo case, older listeners will get me. Look, it's the job of the opposition to highlight to the full extent of its ability failings in the government to the extent they can. It's the job of the opposition to be slightly disingenuous and simplify and exaggerate. Yes, of course. I was talking to Norman Lamont last night. I went to have a drink with Norman Lamont, as you do when you do my job, ex-Chancellor, back in the early 90s. Very experienced person, very versed in financial markets. He was in charge when we had Black Wednesday and the crashed out of the exchange rate mechanism in the early 90s. He agrees with me. This is part of a long-term trend. But the mini-budget was tin-eared. Aspects of it were politically inept, particularly the top rate of tax. And, of course, Labour's going to say this is a crisis made in Downing Street. Of course, the Treasury Select Committee in the House of Commons is going to say that. Because the chairman, even though he's a Tory, used to be Rishi Sunak's campaign manager. He doesn't like Liz Truss. This is how the world works. But that is not to say for 1 second that the government didn't make mistakes in this mini-budget.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you, because, I suppose it's the context of that graph.
Yeah.
It's not the politics in all of this. It's the context of this graph that people have said this was not the right time for many of these moves. And the IMF saying yesterday, for the government to put their feet on the accelerator is unhelpful, e.g. unfunded spending or tax cuts at a time when inflation is already a problem. Now, obviously, that's the orthodoxy and that's the politics that we're seeing at the moment. They don't like the orthodox view. But, it's in the context of that graph going up that one questions whether this was the right time for those measures to be brought in.
Indeed. It wasn't the policies, in my view. They were reversing the top rate of tax back to where it was for the whole of the Blair era.
Yeah.
Hardly extreme.
Yeah.
Hardly extreme. Timing is everything in politics. And again, as I was saying to Lord Lamont last night, to drop a name, but it is interesting that there he is, a Thatcher-era minister, and we were agreeing that even the Iron Lady herself, she was radical quite gradually. She took the country, or part of the country, with her. What she did remains controversial to this day. But very few economists, if they're being honest, would disagree with the fact that, she bolstered the British economy. She sort of revolutionised and revitalised in some way.
But didn't Norman Lamont famously say if Thatcher was in charge now, she would not be cutting taxes in the way that the Truss administration...
And he said to me last night that he thought that the top rate of tax move, even though he agrees with it in principle, was, slightly politically ill-conceived, is the phrase that he used to me. But if I may, there's one other graph I want to show you, because I know in lots of families and in lots of pubs and clubs up and down the country, people will be saying, when I were a lad, interest rates were 15, 20%, and we managed, we just didn't eat any avocado sandwiches.
We've had a lot of emails saying that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let me show you this graph, right? So this is mortgage affordability. This is the share of the average mortgage as a share of the average post-tax income. And you'll see there, or you will if you're watching on television, take my word for it, if you're listening on GBNews radio, you'll see that in the late 1990s, you had
It's Norman Lamont ringing you.
It is. The last time I go for a drink with you, in the late 1980s, the average mortgage was 29% of post-tax income. That's really high. Into the 2000s, it went down and down as interest rates became very, very low. But look at that red line now. We are now almost, if mortgage rates have now gone around 6% on average, we are now back up at 28% in terms of mortgage affordability. The share of the average mortgage as a share of the average post-tax income of those mortgage holders. Even though interest rates are like 6% now on the mortgage rate, and when back in the late 80s, they were 15, 16, 18%. So why is the mortgage affordability or unaffordability now like it was back in the 80s when interest rates were deep into double digits? Because houses then were so much cheaper and houses now are so much more expensive. And this is the political time bomb for the whole of the political and media class who haven't explained this stuff for years, frankly, that people have got themselves into housing deals, financed themselves up to the hilt, really gone for it, stretched themselves to get that family home, to start a family, and they've done so at mortgage rates of like 2, 3, 4%. When they come to remortgage and it's 6, 7, 8%, it's going to be really difficult.
Liam, thank you very much today. I never thought I'd be talking about the ERM and Mandy Rice-Davies in the same sentence, but that's why I love GB News. There you go. You won't get it anywhere else.
Nope.
Thank you very much indeed.